Good afternoon. Let's see how it goes with the sound next door. Um, it has been a pleasure to be here, so thank you for the invitation. What I want to do here today is to provide you with an overview of the Amazon Delta and the transformation of the Amazon Delta and why it's globally relevant. I've been working in this region with the population, rural population and urban population since 1989. Today I'll take a step back to have a broader view of the Delta. So I'll talk a little bit about what is defined as a Delta from both a biophysical and socio-ecological perspective. Try to put that in context so you see how the Amazon looks in relation to the Mekong and to other deltas globally. Then I'll look into the basin. We can step out of the basin and see the connection between the transformation of the Amazon and what are the potential transformations of the Delta region itself. And then zoom back to the Delta, right, and see what's happening there on a very sort of general way, of course, and then make some considerations about governance. Okay, so bear with me, please, because I'll pass to some slides without the time to explain them, but I hope you get the overall narrative of the transformation of the region. So the Delta, the Amazon Delta, it's a very unique Delta in many ways. Not only because of the scale, the size and the dimensions of the Delta, but because of its form. So many people actually would not call the Amazon as a Delta, right? Some will call it an interior Delta. Some would consider just the northern part of the northern channel as the main delta, right? Others, like myself, would consider the entire system, including the southern channel and the other watershed that feeds into that delta because of the unity that they form. So there are many different ways in which this delta has been defined. It's about 20% of the water discharge and the sediment discharge on the ocean. So you can see the scale and the importance of this delta at a global level. At a regional level, it has an enormous influence in the Guyana's coast for about 1,500 kilometers. So it's a very, it's a delta, of course, of regional importance, and has a continental and a global importance, as you see. The way I define the delta is on what I call, and I define in this paper, as a socio-ecological approach. We take the biophysical definition, and we use a particular biophysical definition of the delta, and we cross that with the political administrative units of the delta. And that's a very important, I think, for me to understand how to think about delta problems, because they're just not only biophysical problems, and because of the scale, you need to have that connection to understand, what are the forces, what are the connections between problems at a particular locality and its connection, with the larger system. So that's the definition that I tend to use. And what that means is that we're talking not only about the largest global delta in biophysical terms, but a delta that includes 50 municipalities. So it's a very complex political units, 2 metropolitan areas, a lot of small towns, and a large population of riverine residents. Now, the other aspect that is really important to understand here is that this is one of the poorest regions in Brazil. The level of poverty here is very high. There's no sanitation, basically. So you have a compounding number of social issues at the same time as this is the heart, the economic heart of the Amazon, right? So it's a region of a lot of contradictions, a lot of important contributions, but a lot of problems as well. These are the kinds of populations that I've been working with for a long time. Now, how does it compare globally to other deltas? So the general idea about the Amazon Delta is that it's one of the most preserved deltas globally. So if you compare, for instance, with the Mekong or the Ganges, Brahmaputra, it's relatively intact in many different ways, right? Ecologically, in terms of forest cover, in terms of sediment discharge, So in many ways, the Amazon Delta is seen as a delta that is relatively well preserved. And what I'm going to show here is that we cannot take that illusion. The delta is transforming very fast because of the way the base is transforming, and we have a time lag that we're starting to see the effects now. So the Amazon Delta is very much at the confluence of a basin that is in fast acceleration, right? And also, of course, climate change and sea level rise. So comparatively, in terms of population, as Mark mentioned before, it's a relatively small population. We're talking about 4.3 million people, mostly concentrated in urban areas. Very high degree of urbanization, although overall low population density. And we're still starting to learn what has been the impact on the basin from the transformation of the basin on sediment discharge, for instance. What are the impacts of sea level rise? These are all issues that we're beginning to get a handle on. Now, what is really changing is the Amazon as a whole. The Amazon is probably, the world's largest development experiment, right? In 50 years, since the 1950s, you have government-driven transformation and other forces that have been just, transforming so fast. And now, of course, with climate change and other processes, right, you have a region that is coming to a point and coming to a situation that many are concerned that, it will be a period of a tipping point in the forest-climate balance, which I'll show you here. What is really interesting to see, if you can see the delta there, the delta has been a bright spot when we think about one of the things that we most talk about the Amazon, which is deforestation, right? It's one of the areas where during these 50 years, instead of seeing increasing deforestation, has been the opposite. And you'll see why. The delta actually has been reforesting in a productive way through agroforestry systems. So compared to the Amazon as a whole, it's sort of one of those places where deforestation hasn't been an issue. But that's where we're starting to see the effects of deforestation in the basin affecting directly the delta region. Now, the climate extremes have been, in just the past 10 years, the region is sort of going through a process of change that has caught everyone, by surprise. 2023 and 2024 were the driest years in the region. Entire rivers dried up, right? And it was 24, for instance, was the year with the highest number of fires and burning of the forest. So the region is undergoing a very fast transformation, in part because of those processes, and that we're starting to see the impact on the delta. The main concern that we're talking about today in the Amazon is whether the region is approaching a tipping point in its climate-forest balance. The reason is that the level of deforestation that we have seen is having a direct impact on rainfall in those regions where deforestation is happening. Right? At the same time, with increasing temperature, we're having that sort of crossing of those two factors that are affecting large stretches of forest in this transition to a drier forest. So the models today, suggest that if you pass the 25% deforestation, right, in a scenario of 2.3 degrees in temperature increase, that will represent, at least for the eastern part of the Amazon, a transition in the ecological system. And that means changing rainfall, changing discharge, changing a number of things that are directly affecting the delta region. But there are other sides of the Amazon that are usually hidden of the conversation about the region. One of them, as we were talking about before, are urban areas. The Amazon is essentially an urban region. And most people don't even think about urban areas in the Amazon. Even people in Brazil, even researchers, urban areas is something that doesn't match the imaginary that we tend to have about the region, about the pristine forest, about isolated indigenous groups, which are all there too. But the reality of the Amazon is an urban reality. 80% of the population of the region live in urban areas. 40% of the indigenous population of the Amazon live in urban areas. And these are some of the most precarious and violent urban areas in Brazil. And they have been completely out of the conversation about the Amazon. The other aspect of this transformation is that there are many important advances that have happened during this time. One of them is the demarcation and recognition of indigenous areas in areas of traditional communities and protected areas, which today at the basin level represent about 50% of the territory. So they have assumed an enormous role in managing the region. But we are also seeing the limitations of this model, which I call single-level governance model. You govern within territories of protection, right? But you don't govern outside territories of protection, right? So as deforestation has happened in the headwaters of watersheds, you're also impacted those areas that are protected in indigenous territories or traditional populations and so forth. Now, this is one of the really key issues when you think about the Delta. The number of projected dams for the Amazon is significant. There are already few, but the number of projected dams, not only Brazil, but also in, sort of along the Andes, in the other Amazonian countries, is huge, right? So this, for now, sediment discharge is not an issue in the Delta, but it's something that in the very near future will certainly be. So models projecting the impact of hydroelectric dams, already show the change that can happen in a period of 10 years to 20 years. So in a very near future, we're going to have a very different scenario for the Amazon Delta. So I cannot go into this picture, but if you get a sense of the changing connectivity in free water flow of Amazonian rivers, and also the impact that it has on fisheries. One of the features of Amazonian fisheries is that you have very large fish populations that migrate across thousands of kilometers. So they're a very key part of the economy in many parts of the region. And that is one of the areas where we're going to see significant impact. Why is this relevant? Because Amazonia is a tipping point element of the planet, right? Not only because of fresh water and because of carbon, both stored there, right, and the amount of carbon that it absorbs, but in biodiversity and so forth, right? But it has a direct impact on rainfall pattern in the continent and globally. So how is the Amazon Delta transforming? And here I want to bring also a story of hope in some ways. As I said, very low levels of deforestation. If you can see around the Delta here, you see those red spots. These are deforestation, right? And you see the Delta region relatively intact. Part of the reason is because of the emergence of agroforestry systems. This is acai fruit, a fruit that became globalized during the time that I've been working there. And that is based on agroforestry systems that are locally developed agroforestry systems. And this has become the most important production system in the Amazon as a whole, in terms of inclusion of people working in areas. So what started in the Delta in around the mid-1980s as a response to market demands for Amazonian fruits, today has become one of the production systems most important for the region as a whole. And this has contributed to of course, this pattern that I'm saying, the reforestation and the production on forest-based systems that we see in the Amazon Delta. Now, this is the production system that I'm talking about, acai agroforestry system, right? It's one of the areas where we already see the impact of climate change. So salinity has been increasing and affecting the production of palm. Extreme temperatures, are sort of fluctuating the productivity significantly. Pollinations and extreme droughts, like the past, 2 years, have been significantly affect the level of production and productivity. So we're already starting to see those impacts. Projected sea level rising, which we also see already, for instance, in periods of high tides, right? We see the sort of very different in tidal elevation compared to historical models, so it's affecting significantly the population in the region. And as I said, urban areas is what the, are the key issues in the Amazon Delta. We did a study on 50 urban areas and looking at risk of flooding and vulnerability in terms of the conditions of habitations and where people live. And the majority of the population are in very high degree of vulnerability to flooding, right? Which is the crossing between poverty and flood risk, okay? If you have to have an idea, for instance, the city of Belém, which has about 2.5 million people, the metropolitan area of Belém, it's over 50% of the residents are considered subnormal occupation, right? And are in conditions of flooding. So one of the key issues for the Amazon Delta is, how do we deal with the impact in urban areas? So I've been going very fast here, but I'll be on time for sure. So some issues to consider. Just 2 weeks ago, the government approved oil drilling in the Amazon Delta. This has been an enormous political dispute, which we could talk more, just before COP30, which will happen in Belém, like in 2 weeks. And now we have this reversal in environmental policy in Brazil, right at one of the most sensitive areas of the Amazon. And it's sensitive because if you look at, the dynamics of tides here, and when you think about drilling right at the mouth of the Amazon, any oil spill there would be sucked in for hundreds of kilometers into the Amazon, right? And will spread to the Guianas and to the northeastern coast of Brazil. So a major development that, significant for the Delta. Overall, and this is a general comment, there hasn't been a concern with water-based governance in the Amazon as a whole. I showed that, the incredible advance that, was the demarcation of indigenous areas, protected areas, traditional territories, 50% of the basin, right? But none of that, all the concern is based on terrestrial systems, right? So what you have is a, very important coverage of territories, but a very fragmented form of governance because it cuts watersheds in pieces, where some pieces are sort of open areas for agribusiness, for mining, and other pieces are protected. So there hasn't been attention to water as a unifier of environmental governance in the Amazon, which is some of the issues that we are bringing now. The same thing with urban areas. Urban areas are still invisible, so they're not part of the environmental governance, even though urban populations are feeling the brunt of climate change, whether it's extreme heat, extreme drought, or the pollution created by fire, or the pollution created by mining. Mercury is one of the biggest problems in the Amazon today. You have areas where illegal mining in particular, you have areas where basically 100% of the population in some indigenous areas have high levels of mercury concentration. Anyhow, so water in urban areas haven't been part of the environmental governance in the region. Projected changes in rainfall, particularly in this part of the basin here, but also elsewhere, will have a direct impact on the Delta in terms of discharge on a year-to-year basis. So I would have a whole slide about polycentric governance here, to talk about it. The key issues, I think, and that applies to most deltas, that deltas are nested socio-ecological systems, right? Neither community or large federal or state or municipal level are sufficient to deal with problems on deltas. So, governance of deltas is problem dependent. And that's why that definition of socio-ecological systems are important. If I'm talking about a local problem in the Southern Channel, for instance, that has a particular chain of events and impacts that we need to understand to see what is the best governance level in which you can approach that problem. Other problems will require to step back and think about the governance unit at a much larger level. So I think that's an important thing to talk about Delta. There is not a single level of governance that works. It's very problem dependent. And you need coordination from the basing level to the community level. And that's one of the key issues that we have in Delta regions, I think, is the problem of institutional misfit. The institutions that we organize to manage deltas do not necessarily match the biophysical conditions that are affecting those problems. So, and that goes back to the socio-ecological approach on the importance of defining deltas as socio-ecological systems where the biophysical and the administrative governance units, are matched to deal with different kinds of problems. So I think I'm on time. I rushed. Apologies for that, but thank you.